Rio Mamei, one of the most desolate places in the Panamanian Talamanca region. Far from the nearest trails and more than a day's journey away from the nearest settlement, this is a place where, during the initial search operation for Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, no search team ever ventured. Join us for Part 3 of the 2025 expedition as we deliberately trace the edges of the search area in order to see how much the landscape changes as we descend towards the main river. In April 2014, two young Dutch women perished when they accidentally descended down the Atlantic slopes of the Continental Divide during what should have been a relatively easy 5-hour hike along the Pianista Trail. Until this very day, we do not know what exactly happened to Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon.
De Nederlandse onderzoeksleider Henk Bril erkent dat er in het onderzoek naar de dood van Kris en Lisanne nog een groot aantal vragen onbeantwoord is gebleven. Was het nou een noodlottige verdwaling of is er iets anders gebeurd?
Ik kan het gewoon niet zeggen. Ik kan het niet zeggen. Ik heb wel aangegeven volgens mij waar we het meest aan zaten denken. Maar dit is gewoon volgens mij echt nog iets wat open staat.
Op de stoffelijke resten die zijn aangetroffen, zijn geen indicaties aangetroffen van geweld. Op de kleding die is aangetroffen zijn ook geen indicaties aangetroffen van geweld. Dus dat is sec gesproken de stand van zaken van het onderzoek.
Maar het zou ook zomaar kunnen zijn dat het onderzoek nooit afgesloten wordt totdat we precies weten wat daar gebeurd is.
Dus het kan ook nog altijd een mysterie blijven?
Ja, dat zou zomaar kunnen.
Op de vele vragen rond de verdwijning.
Ik hoop dat het voor alle partijen voldoende is om dit nu af te sluiten en door te gaan met het leven. Want ondanks alle narigheid, het leven gaat door.
Maar 100% zekerheid over de oorzaak kunt u ook niet geven na dit uitputtend onderzoek.
Nee, 100% zekerheid kan ik helaas niet geven.
Bij de laatste zoekoperatie zijn geen nieuwe resten van Kris en Lisanne gevonden. De onderzoekers denken dat dat door de omstandigheden in de jungle ook niet meer gaat gebeuren.
This case cannot be solved. Just let it rest. It is one of the remarks we have heard all too often. We should forget. Life goes on. And from a purely legal point of view, this is probably true. It is unlikely sufficient evidence will ever be found to solve all of the remaining questions. But we would never undertake these expeditions if we weren't convinced that we can get a lot closer to an answer than anyone has ever done before. Perhaps close enough to take away most of the mysteries, which is still giving this case so much media attention. In the previous video, we noted that there are basically two routes which Kris and Lisanne may have taken. The easterly route, which follows the streams and rivers, or the westerly route, which follows the main trail. The night location, where 100 flashlight pictures were taken in the very early morning of April 8th, 2014, must be somewhere close to one of these routes. Finding the night location will tell us what route the two young women took, and knowing what route they took will be an important clue as to what exactly happened to them. But there is more, for when her shorts were found, they contained deep tears, which were almost certainly caused by sliding down a steep, rocky slope. And when a few of the remains of Lisanne were found, it was discovered that 3 of the metatarsal bones in her left foot were fractured. And as there were signs of healing, this injury must have happened while she was still alive. While there are several possible causes for the fracture of multiple metatarsals, one of the most common causes is a fall from considerable height. Another important clue is that image 509, which must have been taken after the last known image, is missing. Up until that moment, Lisanne had been consistently taking picture stops every 15 to 20 minutes, usually taking 2 pictures at each stop. But after the passing of the first stream, no further pictures were taken that day, despite the fact that it took another 2.5 hours before their first alarm calls. So why didn't they take pictures at the idyllic second stream crossing, a place they would have reached about 15 minutes after their last picture, or at the lookout spot on the paddocks? Or could it be they did try to take a picture at this spot, or somewhere on the route back, and their camera failed, resulting in the loss of image 509? What could cause a camera to skip an image number? For some reason, the original investigation had never done much research into this, but when we started to experiment with an identical camera, it turned out to be quite easy to get the camera to skip a number. All it needs is a strong bump to temporarily dislodge either the battery or the memory card. We know Lisanne would almost certainly have been the one taking image 509, and we know her injuries are strongly indicating a fall. While now we see that such a fall while trying to take an image is also one of the most likely reasons for the fact that image number 509 was never written to the memory card. It is also important that such a camera failure would be temporarily. A fall while taking an image will cause a failure to write the image to the memory card, but afterward the camera will continue to function normally, making it possible for the night pictures to be taken at a much later stage. The discovery that a fall could have caused not only Lisanne her fractured metatarsals, but also the missing 509 image has important consequences for the possible route Kris and Lisanne may have taken. For although a fall may have happened at any point along either of these possible routes, a fall while taking a picture implies this accident happened quite soon after the first stream crossing. Although such a scenario can never be totally discounted, it would make little sense if Lisanne stopped making further pictures, hurrying along for 2.5 hours, before suddenly deciding to take a picture at the first cable bridge. Compared to that, it would make a lot more sense if Lisanne fell while trying to make image 509 within 15 to 20 minutes after the first stream crossing, either on the route toward the paddocks or on the way back up to the Mirador. We know there are steep slopes right next to the trail in this area, as well as several spots where people will be likely to take pictures or selfies, and it leaves open the option that Kris and Lisanne walked a short distance along either the first or the second stream to take a picture of a waterfall. However, if Lisanne fell somewhere along the trail, such an accident would have left very clear marks, which would instantly be noticed by anyone walking the trail in the next 2 or 3 days. But locals, who said they walked the trail on April 2nd, did not see any signs of the two young women, and guide Feliciano, who went searching for them in the afternoon of April 3rd, found neither footprints nor signs of any accident. How is this possible? Now, the answer to this riddle may be hidden in the situation high up on the slopes, not far from the top of the Mirador. At this point, the trail is leading through deep trenches, and it has been remarked by her brother, Martin, that Lisanne would definitely not have enjoyed passing through such very narrow spaces. So what if, on the way back, Lisanne decided to avoid these trenches by walking on top of them? And, as it turns out, there is such a trail. The locals use this during the rainy season, when the trenches are too muddy to pass through. However, in 2023, when our team walked this trail, they reported that the easterly branch took them so close to some very steep slopes that they considered it not safe to continue any further, retreating back into the trench instead. So, could this be what happened? If Lisanne walked on top of the trench, Feliciano and anyone else walking the trail in the next few days would find neither footprints nor any signs of an accident, as they all would pass through the trench instead of on top of it. And weeks later, when a full search was conducted, the rain would have wiped away all traces. Sadly, slopes which were once open will have become covered in dense vegetation in the past 12 years, making it highly unlikely we will ever be able to find the exact spot where Lisanne fell down. There is another reason to suggest Lisanne fell quite soon after the first stream crossing, for something seems to have happened to the iPhone of Kris. Although the first alarm call, at 16:39 on April 1st, is made using the iPhone, suggesting Kris was the one who called, the next day this phone is barely used, and with only one exception, all calls are made with the Samsung S3, until the battery of this phone runs dry and they are forced to go back to the iPhone. For some reason, Kris and Lisanne seem reluctant to use the iPhone, and when they finally start using it again, a strange pattern emerges, which has been puzzling researchers for many years. Unlike the S3, they never use the iPhone in darkness, or even at any time close to sunset or sunrise. They only use the iPhone when the sun is high up in the sky, and they completely stop using it after April 6th when the weather is overcast and rainy. Now this starts to get weird, for in the previous episode we already noted that on April 2nd they wait for sunrise before making their alarm calls. Why was the sun so tremendously important to them? Sure, they needed sunlight to find their way through the forest, but why didn't they use the iPhone in darkness or during twilight? Why wait for the sun to be high up in the sky? They did not carry flashlights with them, and apart from the camera, their phones would be their only source of light. Surely, during all those long nights, there must have been a moment when they needed light to check on their surroundings. But after the S3 runs out of battery, they never start up the iPhone in darkness, not even for a quick check. Now, this is simply unrealistic. We know these young women were very serious and disciplined, but nobody can stay for many nights in deep darkness in a tropical forest without at least once pressing the button of the phone for a short moment of light. And they do try to make light, for the logging shows that they try in vain to start the S3 during the night of April 4th and April 10th, despite knowing it has run out of battery. So why did they not start the iPhone instead? There really is only one logical reason why they never used the iPhone at night, and that is that they could not use it in darkness, meaning the backlight of its screen must have broken. If the iPhone did not have a light anymore, it would be useless to start it up at night. As it turns out, a broken backlight is one of the most common problems with the iPhone 4, and, perhaps not surprising, the main cause for this defect is if the phone either falls or gets wet. With a broken backlight, the iPhone can still be used, but for this you absolutely need direct sunlight. Simple daylight on an overcast day will not be sufficient. Using the phone will require you to hold it under a specific angle in bright sunlight, so you can still read the screen, but once you do this, the phone itself will still function normally, so making call attempts is still possible. From what we see in other pictures, it seems that Kris and Lisanne carried their phones in the backpack. And as Lisanne was wearing the backpack at the time of the first stream crossing, it is indeed likely that the damage to the iPhone happened during the same fall which caused the injuries to Lisanne and the missing image 509. And as soon as we assume the backlight of the iPhone broke during a fall shortly after the first stream crossing, a lot of other things start to fall into place. For one, we know that the iPhone produced an unusually large number of log entries during the time between the Mirador and the first alarm call, meaning it was not just passive, but something happened to the phone. Sadly, we do not know what these missing log entries are, as this was never made public. But if the backlight broke, it stands to reason that Kris had trouble figuring out how to use the phone without its light, before making the first alarm call, and this may have taken considerable time. It should be noted that failure of the backlight is not detected in the log of the phone, and as the iPhone was too badly damaged by water to allow it to start again, the Dutch Forensic Institute would be unable to verify such a failure. A broken backlight explains why Kris and Lisanne were reluctant to use the iPhone on April 2nd, and only started to use it again after the S3 ran out of battery. It also explains why they never start up the iPhone at night, and why they instead make desperate attempts to start up the S3 in the very early morning of April 4th and April 10th, despite the fact that the battery of that phone had long ago depleted. Most of all, it explains why they only use the iPhone when the sun is high up in the sky, and why they stop using it when the weather becomes overcast. The fact that they stop entering the SIM pin from April 5th onward can also be explained by fading sunlight and the fact that it became more and more difficult to read the screen under such conditions. Deep in the jungle, with the onset of the rainy season bringing clouds and rain, typing in notes or final messages on the iPhone would simply be impossible, as they absolutely needed direct sunlight to read the screen, and by that time, the sun was no longer visible. The iPhone is started up one last time on April 11th, but although it remains switched on for 1 full hour, the login code is never entered, most probably indicating that whoever is using the phone does not succeed in reading anything on the screen. After this, the phone is switched off and placed in the backpack, never to be used again. So, lots of unexplained riddles suddenly become easy to explain the moment we assume that the fall from Lisanne broke the screen light of the iPhone. But this is not all, for we can also deduce important information about the route they took after the accident. We can calculate how high the sun was above the horizon for each time the iPhone was used. And if we assume they did indeed need direct sunlight to read the screen, this implies that this sun angle must be clear of vegetation at their location at that time. That will give us important information about the terrain they passed through. As the iPhone was usually used once in the morning, when the sun is in the east, and once in the afternoon, when the sun is in the west, we get 2 sun angles for most days, one in the east and one in the west. So that tells us how much open sky was visible to them each day, and this translates to how dense the forest was. Now, one of the first things we see is that Kris and Lisanne did not pass through very dense forest during the times they used the iPhone, as in such conditions they would not be able to see the sun at all. But this is logical, given that they did not carry machetes or any gear. So they avoided very dense forest and probably traveled along some stream where there would always be a bit of open sky visible. The second thing this data shows us is that they were initially in quite open terrain. This confirms what we saw earlier when we analyzed the fact that their first alarm call on April 2nd with the Samsung phone was made almost instantly after sunrise, when the sun was only 6 degrees above the horizon. So the initial alarm calls were made from open terrain, such as the paddocks, or more likely an almost barren slope or former landslide area. In the previous episode, we saw already that large parts of the paddocks were still in the shadow of the easterly hills at that time, and there was only a match for a storage shed on the small paddocks, or at the Refugio shelter near the first cable bridge. However, neither of these places is consistent with a fall, unless Lisanne fell from the first cable bridge. But if that was the case, they would surely have stayed at that spot and be found the next day. There would be no reason to travel on. However, if we discount the vegetation, the shadow map also allows any location on the slopes on the east side of the trail, between the first stream and the Mirador, provided they were about halfway down and not at the bottom of the valley. So somewhere higher up the slope, perhaps 10 or 20 meters below the trail. And this might fit, for satellite images from March 2013 show at least 2 large landslides higher up the slopes. And despite the fast-growing vegetation, such areas would still be mostly barren in April 2014. So, if Kris and Lisanne were at one of these locations, right below a steep slope, that would match with our analysis. A fall at one of these locations would require a person to walk on top of the trench, but we have seen already that Lisanne did not like these trenches, and she may have left them to take a selfie near the edge of a cliff, which would explain why the initial search, which passed through the trench, did not find signs of an accident or notice the 2 young women below. Most importantly, though, this theory explains why they did not stay at the accident site. 2 intelligent young women would certainly have known that, if you cannot climb back up the slope, the best advice is always to stay where you are. And if they had done this, they would certainly have been found. After an exceptionally long dry period, these places high up the slopes would be totally dry, not a single drop of water anywhere near. And we know Kris and Lisanne carried only a few small water bottles with them, which were barely sufficient for a 5-hour hike. This is what makes these spots totally different from every other possible accident site. For if they suffered an accident at the first cable bridge, or second stream crossing, or fell down a waterfall, they would be right next to water and within sight of the trail. So if they were too badly injured to get back via the Mirador, all they needed to do was wait for rescue. But if they were on the slopes of the easterly valley, far away from water, they simply could not afford to stay where they were. They desperately needed water, so if they could not climb back up, they had no other option but to go downhill in order to reach water. But there is more. For if we look once again at these sun angles as derived from the iPhone, then we see that on the first and second day, the sun angle is almost the same, meaning they stayed at one spot in relatively open terrain. But on April 3rd, the situation is very different, and this is the only day when the sun angle to the east is bigger than to the west, meaning they had some high slopes close on their east side, and the ridge in the west was further away from them. And that fits perfectly if they moved downhill to the stream in the center of the valley, for here you have indeed the highest terrain to the east of you. Once they reached the stream, they were so far away from the trail that they must have realized their chances of being seen would be very small, and their best chance for rescue would be to follow the water in the hope that it would lead them to some village. Once again, note this situation is very different from if they had fallen down a waterfall or cable bridge. In those cases, they would be in sight of the trail with water right next to them, so there was no need to move on. But in this situation, they truly had no other choice, and following the water makes sense. Also, they weren't lost. They could probably see the mirador. They knew where they were, but their injuries and the dense vegetation prevented them from climbing back up the slope, and they could not wait at the accident site as they needed water. But judging by the sun angles, their progress was very slow, which probably indicates that both were seriously injured. On April 4th and 5th, they passed through relatively dense forest with the highest slope to the west of them, which fits perfectly with following the stream. A sun angle of 74 degrees corresponds to an open space of around 5 to 6 meters, which matches with the width of the stream. Then, on April 6th, they reach a place where the sun angle is 59 degrees, to the east as well as to the west. Compared to the last 2 days, that must have seemed like a wide open spot to them. So, what would such a spot look like? The 360-degree camera Romain carried with him allows us to accurately turn the camera in any direction at any point. So we wait until he is standing more or less in the center of the rapids before carefully leveling the camera with the local horizon. After that, we command the camera to turn upward by exactly 60 degrees. The result is amazing. The forked tree, which marks the highest point of the surrounding vegetation, is exactly in the center of the camera. So, if the sun is 60 degrees above the horizon, we have direct sunlight at the rapids location, exactly as Kris and Lisanne apparently had on April 6th. Now, we need to be careful. This does not mean that Kris and Lisanne must have been at the Canyon of the Rapids on April 6th, 2014. All we have just proven is that the place where they arrived on April 6th must have resembled the canyon, at least for its width and the height of its shores and surrounding trees. What I personally do find spectacular, though, is that with the sun angles, which were derived from the iPhone log and which have absolutely nothing to do with the night pictures, we have just proven that Kris and Lisanne arrived on April 6th in a deep canyon, which seems to be amazingly similar to what the night pictures show us. So, we have redefined the night location using the phone log. I call that a breakthrough. What needs to be done now is to find out if there are other canyons within the area which resemble the canyon of the first stream rapids, and for which this same scenario with a 3-day hike eastward would work out. This will probably require at least 1 or 2 more expeditions and a lot of study. But meanwhile, for June 2025, we asked Romain to take a look at one other spot as he hiked the complete route along the streams. In later videos on his own channel, Romain will show all footage from his route along the streams, but the location we specifically asked him to visit is located along Rio Mamei, in a sharp turn of the river and next to a small waterfall. Situated on a floodplain, with large boulders and surrounded by steep slopes, this would be the type of place where you could become trapped during an attempt to walk downstream along the shore of the river. About halfway between the first stream crossing and the second cable bridge, this seems about as far as Kris and Lisanne could possibly get in a week time if they walked along the shores of the stream. Although at an altitude of 1,160 meters, this location is considerably lower than the Canyon of the Rapids, and just outside the search area, Earlier drone footage showed us not only a very large forked tree, but also several other Heliocarpus trees near the shore of the river. But although this location is definitely interesting, our main purpose for this visit was mostly to define the limits of our search area, just as we did with the canyon. How exact is our prediction that the night location is situated between 1,300 and 1,500 meters in altitude? And how quickly is the landscape and vegetation changing outside these limits? Locations D and E, which mark the canyon of the rapids, are located just inside the search area near the upper limit. And here we could see an overwhelming abundance of Cecropia and Heliocarpus, as well as red volcanic bedrock, all of them present in the night pictures. Compared to this, location A is situated just below the lower limit of our search area, so if our predictions are correct, this location should show far less resemblances with the night pictures, at least for as far as vegetation and soil is concerned. Another interesting difference is that this location is along a main river, while the canyon we visited earlier is along a stream. One of the main differences we instantly note is that the boulders are much larger here, and, perhaps most surprisingly, there is no sign of moss on these boulders. All along the first stream and down in the canyon, we could see rocks and boulders covered in lichen and moss. But at this location, there is none of that. Perhaps due to the more open and exposed location, or due to the more frequent high water levels. Another important difference is the abundance of large ferns. We can see ferns in the night pictures, and we noted some in the canyon, but nowhere near as abundant as they are here. There is barely any Cecropia, though, and far fewer Heliocarpus trees. And most importantly, the red volcanic rock and soil is totally absent at this location. These items defined our search area, and the limits we set to the search area seem to have been quite accurate around this location. One of the main problems we see, though, is that walking along this stream bed would be far more difficult than at the first stream. With the very low water levels of April 2014, the first stream would be almost dry, and the various boulders are smaller and spaced so far apart that they would not present a real problem. But at the main river, the current would still remain considerable, and moving along the shore would be a very slow struggle due to all these large boulders. If Lisanne was severely injured, it would be next to impossible to make any progress here, or to even reach this spot. Rio Mamei remains one of the most interesting places, as this whole branch of the river was barely searched in 2014 and 2015, despite the fact that it is relatively close to the locations where remains and belongings of Kris and Lisanne were found. In the first weeks after the disappearance of Kris and Lisanne, official search teams never went beyond the Mirador, and local searches concentrated on the areas close to the Pianista Trail, with Rio Mamei simply being too far removed from any trail to be within easy reach of the search teams. If Kris and Lisanne ever made it as far as this location, there was no hope of rescue for them. Not even the locals ventured to this area, and this also explains why no remains or belongings of the girls were ever found along the shores of Rio Mamei. The search team simply never visited these shores, concentrating their search mostly around the village of Alto Romero and close to trails. In later years, people would question why all the remains were found near the village and the trail, but we should turn this question around. Remains were only found at these places because these were the only places which were searched. Nobody went far off trail to remote places such as this. In the absence of any trails, progress through the dense vegetation on the shores is slow, though, and looking down at the river with its big boulders, it is hard to imagine how Kris and Lisanne would have been able to follow this shore, even if the water levels were a lot lower than they are now. There is no doubt that several of the large boulders we see are very interesting. If image 550 shows a large boulder, it would fit a lot better at a place like this than anywhere along the stream. And even bedrock, such as what we see in image 542, would fit here. But the reddish rock and soil is totally missing. and the sky above is far too open, with the river being too wide. While searching the shores, the team makes an interesting discovery: a hollow below a large boulder, which would provide perfect shelter for two lost hikers. Although there is no indication that Kris and Lisanne ever stayed at this place, the find is mostly important due to its consequences. This is the second location we visit and the second place where we find a good shelter against wind and rain. This implies that finding such places in this area is probably a lot easier than is often expected, offering a good explanation as to how Kris and Lisanne managed to survive for so long in gradually worsening weather. It is highly interesting to compare the terrain and vegetation at this location with earlier footage from higher up the slopes, as shown in episode 1 and 2. The lower altitude definitely makes a big difference, and that gives a good impression what we can expect further down and even closer to the cable bridges and the Culebra River. It is hard to imagine, though, how Kris and Lisanne would be able to travel for any considerable distance through terrain such as this, even if the water levels were a lot lower and they somehow managed to walk along the shore of the river. We have already seen that there is a significant chance that Lisanne was badly injured, and it is not impossible Kris became injured as well, which would basically immobilize both young women. Dressed in shorts, without any gear or experience in terrain such as this, the two young women simply never stood a chance. If they did indeed suffer a fatal fall shortly after taking image 508, then they may have been able to follow the stream for 1,000 meters to the canyon of the rapids, but it seems highly unlikely they managed to travel further along the stream to the paddocks of Monte Rey or Rio Mamei. In a new series, which will start later this year on his YouTube channel, Romain will share all further footage from this expedition, including his remaining voyage along Rio Mamei and all the way to Alto Romero. Meanwhile, we will continue to analyze all footage we have shown so far, which no doubt will result in many discussions and perhaps new ideas. There are those who say this case is unsolvable and we should let it rest. But after years of research and expeditions, we have already uncovered more than the official team ever did, and we have visited places none of the search teams ever reached. The night location may be just around the corner, and we might be closer to it than anyone has ever been. There should be a word of warning too, though. Terrain such as this is very dangerous, and once you are off the trail, you are on your own. Even a minor fall or accident can become fatal, and help may be several days away. You should never go off trail without proper guides and all the necessary safety equipment, including emergency beacons. Solving this case is absolutely not something you should risk your life for. That we were able to make any progress in solving this case is almost completely thanks to Romain, without whom we never would have had all this footage. We can never thank him enough for all he did for this case. Organizing these expeditions is very expensive though, and our YouTube channels are not monetized. We are not making any money out of documentaries like this. But without the help of our sponsor and all those who donated to our GoFundMe channel, we would not have been able to visit all these places and test our theories. All comments or suggestions on this video are always welcome, or you can join the subreddit to become part of the team. And if you wish to assist with future expeditions, you will find a link to our GoFundMe site in the video description. We will be back in a few weeks with the latest updates based on discussion within the team, as well as proposals for future expeditions.